Welcome to this course on Christianity and the Enlightenment. Today we come to lecture number 15 on Thomas Reid. This lecture and then the next one on Immanuel Kant both have as their aim trying to respond to David Hume. So Reid and Kant, they don't go together in many ways, but they go together in this way that they're roughly contemporaries, and they're both trying to respond to the upheaval caused by David Hume's skepticism and his new system and way of understanding cause and effect, and that there really isn't cause and effect, Hume argues. Reid is going to have a very different solution to Hume's problem than Kant has. And so these two go together, and they have both left their mark in significant ways on philosophy. Kant much more so. He's on everyone's short list of the most important philosophers in Western philosophical history, but Reid certainly in the 100 years following his death, and in this country in particular, and even more recently, something of a renaissance. So let's talk about Thomas Reid. James McCosh, who was president of Princeton from 1868 to 1888, in his famous book on Scottish philosophy from 1875, said that Reid was in every respect a Scotchman of the genuine type. Quote, shrewd, cautious, outwardly calm, and yet with a deep well of feeling within, and capable of enthusiasm, not witty, but with a quiet vein of humor. See if you think that fits any of you Scotsmen or the Scots that you know. McCosh was himself a Scot, and he was very sympathetic to Reid's common sense philosophy. In fact, many people would mark McCosh as the end of the ascendancy of the Reidian Scottish common sense realism. Come back to that at the end. Thomas Reid was born on April 26, 1710 at Strachan, S-T-R-A-C-H-A-N, pronounced by some as Strawn, Strachan, about 20 miles from Aberdeen, into a ministerial family. His father, Lewis Reid, was the minister there in the town for 50 years. His mother was Margaret Gregory. The Gregorys were an illustrious family in that part of Scotland. He entered Marischal College, spelled M-A-R-I-S-H-S-C-H-A-L, Marischal College in Aberdeen, when he was 12 years old, again, fairly typical for the time. He was a good student, but not exceptional. Many years later, he recounted that while he was in college, and remember, as a college student here, he's 13, 14, 15 years old, that he was plagued almost every night for a year or two by nightmares. Maybe just something for parents or future parents out there, children at this age with trouble. This has been happening for centuries, and someone who turned out to be as illustrious as Thomas Reid said he had nightmares for a year or two. He said sometimes it was as if he was falling, sometimes he was being pursued by attackers and he couldn't move, sometimes he was being devoured by wild beasts. They sound like many of the dreams that people that we still have. I can't move, people are chasing me, I'm falling. Anyways, he overcame these by about the age 15 or 16. He graduated from college in 1726 and was appointed the librarian, young man to be the librarian, but he held that position there until 1736. In 1737, he becomes the pastor at New Macar, which is a rural country parish about a dozen miles from Aberdeen. He received this position as their pastor through patronage. Remember, patronage was always very controversial in Scotland, and it was the system whereby perhaps it could be the town council, it could be regents, it could be one landed gentry, it could be heritors in the town, but some type of elite or aristocracy had the say in who would be the pastor in the church. And it seems that the people were none too pleased to have Reid as their pastor. Their previous minister was much beloved, and he was a gospel man. Reid was very much at home at what would later be called the moderate party in the Kirk. It wasn't that he went out of his way to deny Orthodox Christianity or even to deny Calvinism, but he found it all a bit off-putting and was much more latitudinarian in his theology. Reid was, to be quite candid, not well suited to be a pastor. He spent, one of his early biographers said, he spent much of his years as a pastor ruminating on the philosophy of sense perception. Well, that doesn't always make for the best pastoral bedside manner. In fact, for the first 7 years of his parish ministry, he preached other people's sermons, often from the esteemed John Tillotson, who was the dynamic preacher of the last century, Anglican archbishop. Reid was more interested in studying philosophy than pastoring a church. But McCosh says that Reid gradually won over his parishioners by his good conduct, his general kindness, and his popularity also increased when he got married. He married his cousin, as people did in the 18th and 19th century, his cousin Elizabeth, who endeared herself to the people by exercising compassion for the sick and the poor. An early biographer relates a prayer from Reid on March 30, 1746, so almost 10 years into his pastorate, that indicates that Reid may have had something of a religious kind of awakening as a minister. The whole prayer is long, it's worth reading, but just to summarize, his wife was sick and Reid poured out his heart to the Lord to spare his wife. He also, in this prayer, confessed numerous sins. He said, I've not been as thankful as I should have been for my wife. I've not attended to the spiritual nurture of my wife and children and servants. I've neglected private devotions. I've not been engaged in studies like I should be, and when I have been, it's been in studies to please myself, not to edify the people. I've not spent enough time on my sermons, and a number of backslidings. It's really a moving prayer. Now, whether this was just typical, sort of the form of a penitential prayer that someone would give, and Reid was just filling in the form that had been taught to him, or this was a momentary burst of more affectionate piety that didn't last, or it was a genuine change. It's hard to say, but it doesn't seem to have marked Reid as moving in a lifelong direction toward the evangelical wing of the church. In 1751, Reid is appointed to be a regent at King's College in Aberdeen. So King's College was the older of the two colleges, then Marischal College. King's College founded in 1495, Marischal College in 1593, and then the two colleges merged in 1860 to become the modern University of Aberdeen. But there were two colleges, Marischal where he went, and then King's College where he was a regent, but both there in Aberdeen. He was much more suited for this position, which allowed him to teach and to philosophize and to enjoy the company of many other prominent thinkers in Scotland during those years. He served there for over a dozen years, and in 1764, he is appointed to the chair of moral philosophy at the University of Glasgow. So over from the northeast now to the west side of Scotland, and he succeeds Adam Smith in the chair of moral philosophy at the University of Glasgow, and he holds this position until his death in 1796. While in Glasgow, he writes a friend back in Aberdeen, noting that the clergy on the west side of the country, he said, were fanatical, and that people had, this is an interesting phrase, quote, a gloomy, enthusiastic cast. That's his way of saying these are Jesus freaks, or these people are really into their Calvinism. So there's a kind of enthusiasm, which is their catch-all word for, an abundance of religious passion, but they're also a gloomy cast. But he did say on the positive side, It makes them very law-abiding, stable people. He hasn't heard of a single crime in the year since he's been there in Glasgow. So it's likely that he found the robust Calvinism in Glasgow to be a bit too much for his taste. But still, it is said by witnesses that he would often have tears rolling down his cheek when he would administer the Lord's Supper, that there was a certain deep reservoir of piety that he held on to and served him in his death. All in all, Reid was like many learned men in Scotland of his day. He was definitely not irreligious. He took Christianity seriously. In fact, as we'll see, he had one of his principal aims. He wanted to defend Christianity. But his precise theological commitments were more of the moderate variety. He seems to have been a moral, decent man. He was committed, even here in the 18th century, to the anti-slavery movement. He was committed to reforms in the penitentiary system. He was, as we'll see, genuinely concerned about the rise of skepticism and the displacement of God. Reid was instrumental in founding the Aberdeen Philosophical Society, sometimes called the Wise Club. I'm not sure if they dubbed it that or other people dubbed it that, but it was so called for good reason. The group consisted of some of the most impressive thinkers of the day: John Gregory, David Skene, Alexander Gerard, James Beattie, George Campbell, Robert Traill, James Dunbar. The group met roughly twice a month, and they would do what you think a philosophical society would do. They would hear papers and give papers and receive papers and talk about papers. The society met from 1758 to 1773, and then it seems to have disappeared. Usually there would be, on average, maybe half a dozen, 6 to 10 people in attendance, and they had very strict rules about what they were to drink and eat, and there was an entertainment component to it, but rules about you're not to drink too much because we want to make sure your faculties are intact for these lectures. And Reid was the one who began the Aberdeen Philosophical Society. Once in Glasgow, he participated in the Glasgow Literary Society. Again, an illustrious group of men: Joseph Black, William Cullum, Adam Smith, David Hume, John Miller, James Watt. And Reid was also close friends with Henry Home, that is Lord Kame, as you may remember from a previous lecture. Reid is often hailed, or derided, depending on your view, as the leading light of Scottish common sense realism. Oftentimes, that is said with a kind of disdain. Some think it to be a naive sort of philosophy, and there were a number of seminal religious historians in the middle part of the 20th century who argued that it was Reid's school of common sense realism which infiltrated the colonies and really found a seedbed in old Princeton and worked its insidious magic throughout the history of old school Presbyterianism, which is why there was such a lack of life and rigidity and insistence on inerrancy and all sorts of things that I think are way overblown. And Paul Helseth has done really good work on tracing this out into the 19th century, sort of taking, well, he did it first, but some of what I'm saying and have said about Witherspoon, but he's tracing then into the 19th century. His book, Princeton and Right Reason, or Right Reason in the Princeton Mind, is very good to show that, yes, there was certainly a Reidian cast, but not in these nefarious ways that people often argue. So depending on your viewpoint, Reid is a great hero or a great villain in the history of philosophy. He is often credited with being the father of this common sense movement. It was, as those nomenclatures go, it was much less of an organized movement than people think, and there were a number of important differences. But for the sake of generality, we're looking at people like James Oswald. If someone can make dry erase markers that hold their markerness. That person would be a hero of mine. James Oswald, James Beattie, and a good Scottish name, Dugald Stewart. Oswald was the pastoral popularizer. He was first of all a pastor, and he popularized this. And so if people don't like the common sense school, they especially don't like Oswald. And then there's James Beattie, who is a professor in the Reidian vein, and then Dugald Stewart, who was the only one who was really an earnest disciple of Reid and one of his early biographers. They were different in their approaches, but they're often lumped together as this Scottish common sense school. So what is meant by common sense philosophy? Reid was charged with stealing the phrase from the translation of the French philosopher Claude Bouffier, who is often sometimes considered the originator of some common sense sensibilities. But the phrase was in constant use by the time Reid employed it. And sometimes it was used in a technical sense. Other times it was used in a very colloquial way, as we might even use it today. Oh, he's lacking in common sense. Recall that Thomas Paine's famous pamphlet, which stirred up the colonies to revolution, was called Common Sense. John Witherspoon, toward the end of his life, wrote a short essay called Common Sense, which wasn't about the details of Reid's philosophy at all. It was about, in a just vernacular way, we might talk about someone who has a good head on their shoulders and they make wise, prudent decisions in life. They're full of common sense. Reid himself could use the phrase in sometimes more technical ways and sometimes less technical. That's part of the challenge in interpreting his philosophy. Reid's views were laid out in a series of books, lectures, essays. Let me just mention to you the three leading ones. The first, 1764. Now, this is when the book is published, but Reid had been lecturing on this. He had been thinking about this for decades. An inquiry into the human mind concerning the principles, of common sense. 1864, and we'll say much more about that in a moment. Also in 1785, an essay on the intellectual powers of man, actually plural essays on the intellectual powers of man, and then just one more in 1788, essays on the, I'm going to just shorten this, on the active powers of man. So same thing, this was on the intellectual powers, and then in 1788 on the active powers of man. So what was Reid's main idea? To understand Reid's argument, we have to understand what he was arguing against. More specifically, who he was arguing against. So this is, of course, a vast generalization, but Reid's educational background was rooted in two broad schools of thought. One we might call providential naturalism. Providential naturalism believed that there are laws in nature, as any good Newtonian would have it. These laws fulfilled the providential purposes of God. And if we can ascertain the laws of nature, we can determine the end for which a thing has been created. Isn't this so much of what we've been studying about moral philosophy? There are laws in nature. We have, by way of reason, we can look at human nature, we can look at the law, and that tells us something about the sort of people we're supposed to be, how we're to live our lives, how we're to conduct ourselves. And of course, God is essential to this system. And when we know these things, we can form true beliefs about ourselves, about God, about the world. And sometimes this providential naturalism would move in more of a deistic direction where God and Christianity were just very loosely connected, and sometimes it would move in a much more robustly Christian direction. But this sort of providential naturalism was very common in Europe and especially in the British Isles. And then the second big school of thought, we'll just say, is a certain theory of ideas. And this has been lurking in the background in so much of this course. Almost every major philosopher taught that we cannot access external objects directly. We cannot access external objects. The podium, the trees I'm seeing out the window, sorry you can't see them, this whiteboard, the moon, the stars, the people in front of me, we cannot access those directly. So what's the intermediary? Well, there are ideas between the mind perceiving and the external object. So external object, mind's perception, it's not a direct representation, but there is an intermediary. Those ideas are the objects of our perception. The intermediaries between perception and external objects. Sometimes they're called sensations, impressions, ideas. But the underlying metaphysical explanation was that direct truth about the world existed outside the reach of our faculties. And this had been common way back to the Greeks. So a very homely example. You have a key. Does your mind have direct access to the key? No, your mind is sort of a soft, moldable piece of clay, and the key is pressed into the mind, and it leaves there, literally, an impression, a sensation, an idea. So what you are observing and perceiving about the key is not the key itself per se, but rather the impression, the sensation, the idea of the key that has been imprinted upon your mind. Hard for us to grasp, but very common philosophy in the theory of ideas. Reid said, this theory of ideas developed because, quote, philosophers must have some system, some hypothesis that shows the manner in which our senses make us acquainted with external things. And all the leading lights had something like this theory of ideas. It was not at all controversial. It was there from Descartes. It was also in Locke. It was certainly there with Bishop Berkeley. And it sat next to, usually, it sat next to this idea of providential naturalism. So these two things were very common. And certainly Descartes took Christianity seriously. Locke took Christianity seriously. Bishop Berkeley was a very serious Christian. Nicholas Malebranche would be another one in this theory of ideas. And they all still maintained serious Christianity, the theory of ideas, providential naturalism. Well, Hume comes along and he says, wait a minute. Of course, I'm vastly simplifying, but he says those two things don't fit together. And in his treatise on human nature, 1739, Hume set about to separate these two things. He said, with this theory of ideas, we cannot at all be confident of this providential naturalism. In fact, with this theory of ideas, we can't even be confident about cause and effect. We can see that there are habits, but we really don't know that this event has a cause, because the ideas that we perceive are just our perception of these ideas. So it leads Hume famously into skepticism. Reid had the same view of providential naturalism and the theory of ideas as his contemporaries until he read Hume. And then he came to the conclusion, David Hume was right. These two big, broad ideas that everyone seems to be accepting really don't fit together. But, whereas we might say, Hume said, okay, these two things don't fit together, therefore we can't really hold this, providential naturalism. Reid says, Hume is right, these two things don't really fit together. What I'm going to give up is this dominant theory of ideas. And what Reid put in its place is what we'll come to in just a moment. So how did Reid propose to replace this dominant theory of ideas? Well, here's what Reid wrote in the abstract to his inquiry into the human mind concerning the principles of common sense. Quote, "Ever since the treatise of human nature," that's Hume's treatise, 1739, "was published, I respected Mr. Hume as the greatest metaphysician of the age, and have learned more from his writings in matter of that kind than from all others put together." So there's a tremendous amount of respect he has for Hume. "I read that treatise over and over with great care, made an abstract of it, and wrote my observations upon it. I perceived that his system is all founded upon one principle, from which his conclusions, however extraordinary, are deduced with irresistible evidence. The principle I mean is this." Okay, so now Reid is going to give what he thinks is his summary of the theory of ideas. "The principle I mean is this, that all objects of human thought are either impressions or ideas, which I was very much disposed to believe until I read that treatise. But finding, if this is true, that I must be an absolute skeptic, I thought it deserved a careful examination." That's a great summary of Reid's project. I read Hume, I saw all of his extraordinary conclusions depend upon this theory of ideas, and I believed it at first until I saw that if this is right, I must be a skeptic. And for Reid, that was a bridge too far. Reid thought the Cartesian system led directly to skepticism. He saw it in Malebranche, he saw it in Locke, he saw it in Berkeley, and though they themselves were not skeptics, he thought they had the seeds of it, which then came to full flower in Hume. He rejected their assumption that what we know about the objective world is simply the ideas we have to resemble those objects. Reid, in other words, banished these intermediaries between perception and external objects. And what he comes up with instead is a philosophy of common sense. Just listen to, so here's one edition of the Principles of Common Sense, an academic critical edition. And just listen to the section titles for chapter 1. Section 1, the importance of the subject. 2, the impediments to our knowledge of the mind. 3, the present state of this part of philosophy of Descartes, Malebranche, Locke. 4, apology for these professors. 5, of Bishop Berkeley. 6, of the treatise of human nature. 7, the system of all these authors is the same and leads to skepticism. And then the last section, we ought not to despair of a better. You see very much what he's doing, tracing this theory of ideas, saying it leads to skepticism, but he says there's a better way. And what is this better way? Let me read to you. He says, in this unequal contest betwixt common sense and philosophy, the latter will always come off both with dishonor and loss, nor can she ever thrive till this rivalship is dropped, these encroachments given up, and a cordial friendship restored. For in reality, common sense holds nothing of philosophy, nor needs her aid. But on the other hand, philosophy has no other root but the principles of common sense. It grows out of them and draws its nourishment from them. Severed from this root, its honors wither, its sap is dried up, it dies and rots. So he says, you got philosophy and common sense. Common sense doesn't need philosophy, but philosophy needs common sense. He goes on to talk about Bishop Barclay and how his ideal system was really this theory of ideas brought to its logical extreme, where Barclay says, not only can we not pursue, are there intermediaries between us and the objective world, but there is no objective world independent of our perception. And he says, from Barclay, then, it was but a short step to lead to the skepticism that we find in Hume. And part of what he's going to do to counter Hume is to gently ridicule and suggest that Hume and these other philosophers, they don't really believe their own principles. They don't really live according to the philosophical principles that they espouse. So he says, I cannot imagine that the author of the Treatise of Human Nature is so skeptical. He believed against his principles. He's imagining that Hume is on trial for his views. He says, he believes that his principles should be read, that he should retain his personal identity till he reap the honor and reputation justly due his metaphysical acumen. Indeed, he ingeniously acknowledges that it was only in solitude and retirement that he could yield any assent to his own philosophy. Society, like daylight, dispelled the darkness and fogs of skepticism and made him yield to the dominion of common sense. Nor did I ever hear him charged with doing anything, even in solitude, that argued such a degree of skepticism as his principles maintained. Surely, if his friends apprehended this, they would have the charity never to leave him alone. There's actually a bit of wit in Reid's writing. It's hard to just hear it read to you, but what he's saying is, look, Hume said that he never doubted that his personal existence was there. He never doubted that people could read his works, that they could apprehend the external objects of the published page. And if Hume really believed and operated according to his skepticism, we would think him mad, and his friends would never leave him alone because they'd be concerned for his health. Let's look at it a little more philosophically. Principles of common sense for Reid are those founded not upon inference, but rather are self-evidently true. These are self-evident truths, beliefs that are held immediately and justifiably. Now, people, both past and present, will get frustrated with Reid and say, look, you haven't really offered us any proof for your principles of common sense. To which Reid would say, exactly. These are the things that cannot be proven. They come before proofs. They, in fact, are the principles upon which we prove other things. These are the irreducible minimums that all sentient human beings share. So in his essays on intellectual powers, Reid gives a helpful enumeration of the principles of common sense. Now, he's delineating between necessary principles and contingent truths, and these are the contingent truths. That just means they're not axiomatic like 2 + 2 is 4. But in practicality, they're still close to necessary truths. These are first principles. Here, this gives you an idea what he means by self-evident principles of common sense. 1, first then, I hold as a first principle the existence of everything of which I am conscious. Right? I am conscious of myself. I exist. 2, another first principle, I think, is that the thoughts of which I am conscious are the thoughts of a being which I call myself, my mind, my person. Okay, I'm not a brain in a vat. I'm conscious of it. Again, he's not arguing. This is not Descartes, who is stripping himself of all previous knowledge and saying, cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. I've proved it. Reid is saying, I'm not proving it. These are just self-evident. We all believe this already. 3, another first principle I take to be that those things did really happen, which I remember. 4, our own personal identity and continued existence. 5, those things do really exist, which we perceive by our senses. 6, We have some degree of power over our actions and determination of our will. 7, the natural faculties are not fallacious. 8, there is life and intelligence in our fellow men. Debatable at times, but Reid says no, we all agree on that. 9, certain features of the countenance, sounds of the voice, and gestures of the body indicate thoughts and dispositions of the mind. 10, there is certain regard due to human testimony in matters of fact. 11, there are self-evident probabilities, greater or less according to circumstances. 12, the last principle I mentioned is that in the phenomena of nature, what is to be will probably be like what has been in similar circumstances. Again, it's a mouthful to hear someone read to you 12 contingent truths of common sense. But if you could strip away the erudite philosophical language, I think for the most part, maybe you quibble with a few of them, but most people, non-philosophers, are going to say, yeah, I think I exist. Yeah, I think the people I'm talking to exist. I think there's an external world. I think generally that what I'm seeing and smelling and perceiving is really there. Common sense for Reid means that every sane human being who's no longer an infant, not mentally impaired, shares in common with every other human being these principles. And the philosopher, Reid says, has no option but to join the rest of humanity. Quote, philosophy has no other root but the principles of common sense. Common sense is not a special term. You don't have to be a good person or even a wise person. Foolish people have common sense. So it's important here, he doesn't mean wisdom necessarily. He doesn't mean that everyone is really smart, they make good life decisions, they're really good with their money. That's not what he means. He simply means that everyone shares in common these self-evident, non-provable, contingent truths. So another example from the essays on intellectual powers, which will show you what Reid is up to. He says, after quoting a long paragraph from Hume, which he is going to disagree with, he says, we have here a remarkable conflict between two contradictory opinions, wherein all mankind are engaged. On the one side stand all the vulgar, who are unpracticed in philosophical researches and guided by the uncorrupted primary instincts of nature. On the other side stand all the philosophers, ancient and modern, every man without exception who reflects. In this division, to my great humiliation, I find myself classed with the vulgar. That's a tremendous admission by Reid. That look, you have normal people, vulgar people, who are just guided by their own natural instincts. And then you have the philosophers who philosophize about these theories of ideas and the external world and their perceptions and their mind. And Reid says, I have to admit, I think the vulgar people are right. We have the faculty of perception, faculty of memory, faculty of consciousness, and these are reliable for belief formation. Now, note carefully, he's not naive to think, well, everything we perceive is accurate or whatever we remember is accurate. He's making a philosophical claim. He's claiming that we really perceive things. We really remember things. We are really conscious of ourselves and the external world. One of the criticisms of Reid will be it lends itself to a naivete about our powers of observation. And that may be a fair criticism, but I think Reid anticipated that and said, I'm not saying we don't make mistakes. Of course we do, or we can't misremember things. But he's arguing that memories and perceptions do give us a real, unmediated understanding of real life and the objective world. Sometimes he calls these axioms, sometimes first principles, sometimes common sense, common notions, self-evident truths. Positively, we can say common sense is what we take for granted. Negatively, he would say the opposite of common sense is what we call absurd. So one objection to Reid might be that it's not at all obvious what we all take for granted. But he's saying we have common sense in these two ways. Sometimes we mean we all take it for granted, it's common sense, and then other times he means these are the first principles in our reasoning. So there's both a more colloquial understanding and a more philosophical, technical understanding as Reid describes it. Importantly for Reid, he says, people profess to doubt these principles, but they do not actually doubt them. The skeptic says he doubts them, but he lives otherwise. What is manifestly contrary to these principles, we ridicule and call absurd. So here's a famous line from Reid. In all the history of philosophy, we never read of any skeptic that ever stepped into fire or water because he did not believe his senses. Okay, you people with your fancy Berkeleyan idealism. Now, of course, Berkeley would say, we still have those perceptions, and I still perceive the fire to be hot, even if it doesn't exist independent of my mind. But Reid is making a simpler point. Look, the philosophers have these highfalutin theories. They don't really live by them. And important in Reid's system is God. God's trustworthiness implies that our sense perceptions are, on the whole, reliable. God gave us faculties, and he's not, remember Cain said, a benevolent deceiver. He's not giving us illusions. So Reid trusts the deliverances of consciousness. And so he says in one other place, at the end of Inquiry into the Human Mind, he says, these notions, inspirations of the Almighty, no less than our notions or simple apprehensions, they serve to direct us in the common affairs of life, where our reasoning faculty would leave us in the dark. They are part of our constitution, and all the discoveries of our reason are grounded upon them. They make up what is called the common sense of mankind, and what is manifestly contrary to any of those first principles is what we call absurd. When a man suffers himself to be reasoned out of the principles of common sense by metaphysical arguments, we may call this metaphysical lunacy. So Reid says, we really, unless you are certifiably a lunatic, you live by these principles of common sense. So how should we evaluate Reid? He was the anti-philosophy philosopher. He said philosophers need to argue like everybody else. They don't get a pass because they're philosophers. We all take certain propositions for granted. We have certain beliefs we hold immediately, not as the conclusion from other beliefs, but nevertheless we hold them rationally with good evidence. Truths like I perceive my senses, I have a will, I remember things. Now, he's anti-philosophy, not because he's really against the philosophers, but actually because he has such a high view of philosophy. He thinks the philosopher has a high calling in society. And that's why it's important to Reid that philosophers own up to the way they really live their lives. He says their philosophy has the semblance of madness, but it's a pretense. Philosophers are not crazy, they just sound like it. But the burden of proof, Reid says, must be on the person who wants to deny elements of common sense. If you're going to say that the external world doesn't really exist, okay, you're going to have to prove me. The burden of proof is on you, because that's not how people really live their lives, Reid says. Now, this does not make him what later would be called a classic modern foundationalist. He isn't saying, in a Cartesian way, we just strip ourselves of everything and then from our own rationality we just build up a system. Actually, he's saying the opposite. He's saying we can't do that. Even if we wanted to, we all start with these principles that we take for granted. He was by far the most important Scot to the American university from the late 1700s and for the next 100 years. Again, as I said at the outset, people sometimes see this as a very negative consequence, that people were beholden to, Reid's naive, common sense ideas and set back the colonies or Presbyterianism. But I'm going to suggest that there's a much more amiable way to see his influence. For starters, it's not as if everyone who relied on Reid was really steeped in his philosophy. But Reid was a very convenient apologetic tool. Here was a guy who was a legit world-class philosopher. And you got skepticism, you'd say, hey, Reid dealt with that. Barclay's idealism, hey, Reid dealt with that. Remember, one of the things about Witherspoon in Princeton is he wanted to rid Princeton of any of that Edwardsian, Barclayan idealism. It wasn't that Witherspoon, I think, was a real earnest student of Reid. He knew of Reid, knew of his ideas. But I think Witherspoon just thought that idealism was silly and didn't make sense, and Reid did. And I don't want to get too far into psychologizing the mind of Americans, but I will just a little bit. Whether it's chicken or egg, I'm not sure, but you can make the case that isn't there something in the American cast, in the American mind, that would certainly resonate with Thomas Reid. I mean, he's going to knock down the elites a notch or two. He has a sophisticated argument for what he's maintaining, but it's a way to say we can still believe in God, we can still believe our senses, maybe at its most extreme, saying, look, we don't have time for all of these highfalutin, pie-in-the-sky sort of philosophies that people never really believe in anyways. We got to get down to doing things and solving things and conquering a continent and all the rest. You can certainly make the case why Reid might appeal to an American sensibility. And you have to remember that many of the people that found Reid appealing were themselves Scottish transplants and were Presbyterians in the middle colonies or through Princeton and there to the Republic. So there's lots of reasons for the connection. Reid, not surprisingly, faced many serious criticisms from Thomas Browne, we heard about in a previous lecture, from Scotland. Joseph Priestley, most famously from England, was the most serious critic. His major criticism was Reid has completely misunderstood the theory of ideas. We'll leave that for the philosophers to figure out, as this is class on history and theology and philosophy somewhat, but without entering into that debate, to note that Priestley thought Reid's arguments amounted to, quote, these things are so because they are so. And I think Reid would say, yeah, that's my argument. They are so because they are so, but they are so not without warrant, not without some evidence. And the burden of proof is on you to convince us that you live your life by some other way. Reid's philosophy enjoyed a century of support in America, all the way through James McCosh at Princeton. But by the middle of the 19th century, common sense was falling out of support. And for the next 100 years, it sort of wandered in the wilderness, and you wouldn't hear about Reid's philosophy. He was not the philosopher du jour, but in recent decades, he's enjoyed something of a renaissance. Nicholas Wolterstorff has argued for the significance of Reid's insights and appropriated some of them. Reid fostered what Wolterstorff calls an epistemological piety, which he said is a blend of humility and gratitude. On the one hand, humility because we can't know everything. We can't dispel all the darkness. Philosophy can't answer all the questions. Humility, but also a gratitude because God has given us intellectual powers. He has given us active powers and agency, and we can trust that God is not deceiving us, and He has given us sufficient common sense that we might reasonably know ourselves and know the external world. I like that As Walter Dorff argues, that mix of humility and gratitude coming together in epistemic piety. So Reid is certainly going to cast a long shadow on the American colonies. And even though his ideas may have fallen into disrepute from the 19th into the 20th century, there is still much that we can learn from Reid. Whether we adopt all of his philosophical principles, I think many of us still would resonate with a certain common sense feeling that if we are to do philosophy properly, we must do it in a way that makes sense for how we really live our lives.